Masters of Silence are nobles.
Right.
They were like basically bringing his power down.
Mm-hmm. And still, he was doing a lot.
Yeah.
Drago is another good one too, but his powers are kind of hindered right now since he can't really come out and do a lot with them. And what he does do in the warp, like the dude literally, like, demons are scared to even go up to him. It doesn't really matter because it's the warp. It just heals itself. So.
And the thing I don't like about Drago is that it's mostly plot armor that's holding him up, I feel. But, yeah.
Yeah.
Next question comes from...
I got one from Jubert Shackelstein. If you could pick any Primarch to be your best friend for all eternity, who would you want? That's an interesting one.
Since we were just talking about powerful psychers, I would say Magnus the Red, just because he can teach me some things. And also...
he's just cool. But I feel like he'd use that, like, for his own benefit. Like, he's like, yeah, you could be best friends with him, but it doesn't mean that he reciprocates those feelings. So after a while, if he gets tired of you, he's like, hey, just cut your finger and create this sigil on your chest, and then boop, now you're a chaos spell.
Yeah, I do. Yeah, I could see that too. But maybe that's why, like, you have to play on it, and then know that he's going to betray you. So you need to betray him, maybe. No, that seems like too much work. Now you got me thinking that I should just pick somebody like Rogodorn.
Yeah.
But then he'll be boring.
It's like, let's go to the beach, and he's just building sandcastles across the whole thing.
The whole time, yeah.
Mm-hmm. But I was thinking maybe you could make it work with Magnus if you're like, it's like a Rick and Morty type thing. You're the Morty to his Rick, where he's like super smart and like can create all these crazy things with magic, but Rick it's more science.
Yeah. But then that would mean that Magnus the Red would have to like require me to be there just for like mental and social support, which means that he himself, Magnus, is just like not as stable as you think, mentally wise. Or like, yeah. He's one click away from ending it all for himself. What about you? Your best friend, Primarch?
At first, I was going to say Vulcan, because the dude's just a swell guy overall.
That's true, yeah.
He'd read me bedtime stories, teach me how to smith.
Smithing all day.
Yeah. But I think it'd be pretty cool to also have the freaking angelic Sanguinius, because then you could fly around.
Yep.
It's like, oh, I'm late for La Cucaracha dance at my 15. Nope, he got me.
Yep, with the dress and all. He picks you up with that giant gown.
And it'll look luscious because it's blowing in the wind, because he's like bringing me down from his wings.
It's like in the scene of Cruella when she gets on the garbage truck and then she goes away and then the garbage comes out. It's like a little bride thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. This question comes from Victor Kamursu. Why did Gilliman hate Perturabo? Most people hated Perturabo because he was just kind of like that friend in the friend group that everybody beats on. And then you're like, stand up for yourself, and he doesn't. And you're like, well, I'm not going to stand up for you. I think that's what it was.
Yeah. It's like, come on, we're all going to the party. And he's like, nah, I'm going to make my own Terminator suit.
Yeah, he was very gloomy like that. Yeah. Also, like, his method of war was not appreciated by Gilliman, who Gilliman was more tactical. And then Perturabo was like, no, if you do this, it works every single time during a battle. It's like, yeah, but that's just a battle of attrition, or that's just a battle of, like, brutality. Yeah, but it works. And I think Gilliman didn't like that. Yeah.
This next one is by TSL Frontman. He says this is his 10th time asking. But surprise, we actually answered this before. I think it was like your second or third time asking. But anyway, hopefully you guys, or you, I assume it's this one person, actually hears this response. A Grey Knight rolled too many ones and fell into a hole, like Sokka, and cannot reach his teleporter button or something. Could a greater demon or something walk up and corrupt him? And if so, what would they turn him into? So basically you're saying, can a Grey Knight get corrupted by a demon? And as of right now, no. The Grey Knights are incorruptible. They are Grey Knights because of their super high tolerance to all things chaos. They wield demon weapons and they don't get corrupted. They can traverse the warp and not fall into the temptations of Slaanesh or whatever. So yeah, they they're super tough.
But if they were to turn a Grey Knight into anything, I feel like it would be chicken tenders.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Demons actually really love tendies.
I mean, who doesn't?
That's true. AMC to the moon. This is past the weekend. I wonder what happened during the weekend. But anyways, next question.
Cool Minecraft. Could the Custodies have defeated the Marine Legions? That's interesting. Because every time we talk about the Space Marines fighting against the Adeptus Custodes, usually the Custodes comes out on top. They did take out pretty much a whole Primaris chapter. They didn't really break a sweat doing it. So I think if they really put their mind and their dedication to it, yeah.
I really think it also, though, depends on their situation. Like, if they're on Terra, yeah, that's their home ground.
Mm-hmm.
The Imperial Fist might be able to, like, do something. But, like, back in 30K,
Well, back in 30K, they had different weapons and stuff. Like, it was, like the radium weapons, the, what are those things called? Like, radium, and, like, they were using, like, nukes and, like, super devastating weaponry. So everybody had access to it, so of course the Space Marines would be using it against them.
Yeah. What was I gonna say? But I do feel like there was more Legionnaires than there were Adeptus Custodes.
Oh, for sure. They're going to be outnumbered, no doubt about it. But it's like kind of the same thing where it's like the world is getting taken over by chaos. You don't send the entire Grey Knights, you send like a squad, and that's usually enough.
Yeah.
So like the same thing with the Custodians. You can send all the Custodians,
Weapons
so send
online.
a few of them, and that's
All
usually
systems nominal.
Looks like friendlies are already engaged with hostile forces.
There should be like a
Their
simulator game
survival
that
is
does
not our
this,
priority, but there's
but
always
doesn't
plenty
use the
numbers in
stats
a
of like
combat zone.
the tabletop,
do what
but
we can
uses
to
the
help them
stats of
out.
like
They will make
the
earning
lore or
a
something.
combat bonus all the easier.
Kind of like when we see like 1,000 Hulks versus 1,000 Spider-Mans. Who wins? I think that'd be kind of
At what point can 3-year-olds beat you to death?
cool. What's the answer? A trillion?
Lag spotted.
I don't think it takes that much.
For 3-year-olds?
Target
Yeah.
commander.
Oh, you could destroy a whole like plethora of 3-year-olds. Like anybody. And not even because like, oh, the rest of it's scared. Like, you could literally just start your way through the ground. Or swinging your hand through the ground. Your body would be tired.
So that's what it's like when the Space Marine fights humans.
Yeah. That's why one Space Marine can take out like an entire regiment. Or at least a Chaos Regiment. That happened in the Xeno's book of...
Is that still going to be a show?
Wait, so what's the limit then? Like if you're going up to...
I'd say like 1,000.
Yeah, I think I'll be a never ending.
Yeah. Yeah, but it's like the more flesh you pound, the longer you go at. You would
Your location at any moment.
like you just like collapse and then it's a big dog.
The only in your advantage because you're expected to sleep.
Take turns.
Yeah, like half of just sleeping. Because I'm just like a completely blank. The hyper. But if it's like the city, you can hide it. That's true, yeah.
Bean Eater. Do they have
So, no. The game is actually a, I forget what it's called, like, or like campaign or something. It gives area. If it does pick up in that area, then it's just a distilled agave. And I don't think that Mexico before this.
Yeah. Right with the techno bar.
Grab that one.
Yeah. Fire. Agave plant. They got nuclear.
Flying
Wind.
ship.
Yeah.
Out. Hostiles.
This one's probably type 5 and nuke, or maybe even orbital bombardment. Void. That makes me something so powerful. Everybody. Yeah. Let's say you throw a nuke and it does weaken it, and you.
I agree.
Nothing.
Maybe Chuck Norris. Is that?
I think it is.
Yeah. I think you'll see how like when or whatever. Modern threats. Where we used to simple speak really high pitch. I forget who's the internet was like super new. Comment down below. This is a song.
No, this one's probably that big green. Could person any and go better into state. She's slender, but essentially the best.
Enemy spotted.
I don't know if you're referring to on in the lore or the tabletop, but works for her in chapters. Pretty much the character.
Situation.
Yeah. Put out a crazy, insane amount of attacks.
Probably
Yeah. She can, but she can't take it. No.
thing for a Disney. Oh, no, because the initiative was back in the day. You.
That was half
Are orcs and Tyrion edible? If so, how best prepare a hero? They both are. When it comes to orcs, I talked about this. You can make pie. Every single element of a sand out of plant, grow, ferment, and all that kind of stuff. So you can make bread out of it.
What is it? Glue?
I bet you like they're the type of food that you have to put so much spice. Yeah, a spoonful of those seasonings. Yeah, like
Those aren't sponges. Those are like scouring pans. Like steel.
if you clean a cast iron skillet, maybe. But now, in a regular sponge.
And I don't remember.
One little like trivia. We first, I think it was probably your first, right? This restaurant together, and they used to have a bowl of. They used to, it was good. I used to go there. One day, I guess the guy who was prepping the nachos. Yeah, inside of the nachos. So they obviously got their meal for free because freaking they're not. It was crazy. Were you there?
Oh, that.
It was a big deal. On accident, obviously.
Yeah. Accident. But he's white. I'm coming for it.
Yeah, I felt really bad because there was a big group of her like woman, and I think she was with her husband, and this it seemed like like glasses of water, and I was serving them. On her neck goes, and then the dad husband was. They all got it. And those were the questions for today. If you guys for hello.
As always, this has been Japanese.
The brightest minds and might always comes a time when the great must soft whispers pray by such finally one among the fear most. The end of time. Finally,
Spider contract.
the tides
and
of
have a narrow
damnation
window
will
to heal if you're ready.
panic battle to decide the fate of those in the glimmer of the Dark Brothers. Know that it is if or when. Yet remains for a moment, with some even believing it can be greater perhaps the great lords who live on such a champion. Yet the southern who work in this preaching the clever humanity. So what this
Is
year's
lighting targets. Clear proceed.
the world will be up. It will one of those known as ever. I just will all the forces of against the many have held this title thus far, proving yet they were all struck down on mighty accomplishments. However, each one of them failed told by Necrodomo the Insane to bring about who turn nations and burn continents to ash. Shall be as one would expect, shrouded in darkness and terror. A terrible storm with it more than just from the shadows. Eager to plunder and glory their dark. They launched a surprise assault against the hunting village. Both were collecting their for it was away non-wrath, leaving those among who are vulnerable. It was the Norskin slaughtering way across the marauders was that with her children prayed for despair. Berserker smashed in her yet she did not spare. Mechwarrior gathered her courage and approached the North. Accepted this. The family was spared.
Commander, prepare for mech
The men of
extraction.
turned to find many bushes, having oil. Roald Rothschild was relieved to find his family still living. The previous price paid. His resentment only festered as her belly grew with child. A reminder of the horrible night which each day leaves the life of life. Waiting until the fateful day. Childbirth in the Warhammer world is certainly dangerous. Birth is described as unholy. Victoria's final hours of
చేరుకు ఫ్రెండ్ టెక్నిక్ ఎపిసోడ్ 117 కి అందరికీ స్వాగతం. సరికి అవుతుంది ఇప్పుడు న్యూస్ అయితే సరికి బీజే నుంచి
So we're going to be talking about these images available.
The largest robot technology companies, a mission to Venus, China hosted robotics RA. Guests were greeted by Yu Yang robotic delegation includes the Yu Yang Mini models. Yu Yang, a robot designed for business to do, it has many usage scenarios. The Yu Yang Mini light robots with voice interaction, autonomous mapping, real obstacle avoidance functions, as well as the ability to follow specific command. The Hitachi presents controlling a robot when working with shape-shifting objects. Features are work that only humans can occupy because they have to work with tissue, anything soft, anything shape. Technology automatically retrieves the necessary information robot and the with shape-shifting objects, the robot program perform unlearned movements based on voice instruction, object, and the type of movement. That is, the robot can be commanded to unzip a green zipper, and it will do
They
so.
operate without regard to civilian rights and protection, raiding and
The
pillaging
Italian
at will.
Institute of
More
Technology presented its new
mercenaries.
teleoperated
They're also
robot at the
extremely
ICRA 2021
I see them
conference.
pop up
The
on the
robot
mercenary
combines the
review
strength
board
and power of
records
its
from time to
processor,
time.
the high-Q reel,
Not within
which you
a
can
brief
find at the link in the
justify
hint,
their size,
and gave it a
wealth,
new
or shape
robotic arm
power.
controlled through a VR helmet. Skeleton fingers.
I'll
The
keep searching
teleoperated
and
robot,
see what more I
referred
can
to as
find.
teleoperativo,
Spears
is
said
designed to
he'll do the
work
same.
in difficult and
Good.
dangerous human
I won.
environments. It can open
We all
doors,
want our
reach
pound of flesh
firefighting
from these
equipment,
bastards.
collect valuable objects,
So, what about
navigate
this
in
new
the dark,
contract?
and walk
Yeah,
over difficult
could be
terrain.
interesting.
The controls are
Seems a
intuitive,
group
with the
of
operator
indentured
seeing
employees
everything from a
reported to the
first-person
Apex Mining
perspective.
Syndicate are being taken advantage of and are suffering
Tencent
under
Robotics
horrendous working
X Lab,
conditions.
which not long
In an
ago
attempt to
introduced
force
its
syndicate
four-legged
on board
robot
in
combining
turn.
legs
The
and
workers want
wheels,
us to inflict
showcased a
some
new
serious
development
damage
at
on
the
two of
conference.
syndicate's
The
more
robot
critical
Ollie
mining
is based on the
installations.
lab's
They
accumulated
believe the
mobile
only
control
language these
technology.
people
It's
understand
positioned
is
as a
the
breakthrough in
almighty
motion
seagull.
planning, balance,
It's hard
and
to argue
stability.
that logic.
Ollie, only
Sounds like a
35
noble
centimeters tall,
cause.
can jump
Maybe,
up steps to 40
if they're ready
centimeters,
and willing
jump
to
up
pay for
60
our
centimeters,
services.
and
And we could
perform
use some more
360-degree
seagulls
somersaults.
ourselves. I've filed
The
the mission
robot
briefing
keeps its
already.
balance when
You
moving
just
on
need
an
to
uneven
sign off on the
surface,
operation
bumps, and
and get us where
collisions.
we need to go.
It's energy efficient
that.
due to the use of wheels and is also quiet. Ollie also has the ability to plan the trajectory in advance and maximize motor performance to achieve a given movement. Robotics and Autonomous Systems Group, CSIRO, spoke at ICRA about advances in the development of its unique Magnapods autonomous robot inspector for condition monitoring, repair and maintenance of metal structures. The robot can change the number of legs depending on the task and moves by magnetic adhesion. Magnapods can climb into the most difficult terrain and hard-to-reach places and work in confined spaces. A connected tether provides a data link as well as other power tools for the robot. This removes limitations on the robot's operating time and allows the robot to be controlled remotely. Robotic Systems Labs presented a predictive control model of robot environmental interaction for mobile manipulation tasks at the conference. Today's torque-controlled service robots can adjust the contact force when interacting with its environment, but they often need an accurate model of their environment, and the robot needs to be retrained to interact with objects in a new environment. Robotic Systems Lab engineers combined a control-based whole-body controller with predictive models with two adaptive circuits derived from online system identification and adaptive control. This allows a conventional mobile arm to interact with unknown environments without the need to reset parameters or pre-model interacting objects. Robotic Systems Lab also recently showed off its four-legged robot for Mars exploration. On the Spacewalk robot, engineers tested static and dynamic motion with two different types of foot, point and passive adaptive flat. These tests were conducted on the ExoMars rig with a simulated Martian surface and at an angle of 25 degrees. Robotic Systems Lab engineers also showed off a new area of their research, the dynamic animatronic Dynu. Usually animatronic figures are static, that is, they are not capable of independent movement in space. The researchers decided to bridge the gap between animatronics and mobile robots. The end result was supposed to be a realistic and cute character that could be programmed to behave nimbly as a four-legged robot. Unitree Robotics, which says its goal is to create robot dogs as affordable as drones and smartphones, has unveiled another robot dog, and now for just $2,700. Go-1 is a small-sized robot that has positioned as a reliable autonomous companion capable of following humans and avoiding obstacles. There are 3 versions of the Go-1: the basic Go-1 Air for $2,700, the Go-1 for $3,500, and the Go-1 EDU for $8,500. The middle version reportedly includes better recognition and computation, as well as a 50% longer battery life. The robot's top speed is 17 kilometers per hour, but that probably applies to the older version. The Go-1 EDU also offers high-performance computing, 2 kilograms more payload at up to 5 kilograms, as well as leg force sensors, live hardware interface, and API access. The Massachusetts Institute of Technology is developing a dynamic humanoid robot that will traverse any rough terrain with ease. On its own, after all the tricks of Atlas the robot, it wouldn't be too impressive if it weren't for one nuance. MIT engineers create not only one robot, but also all the software infrastructure needed to make the two-legged robot do what they wanted. In other words, what will come out of the simulation is not just a robot, but universal software for rapidly learning humanoid robots. The MIT humanoid itself looks like a vertical version of the mini cheetah robot, but that appearance is deceptive. While the robot's torso and arms are very similar to the mini cheetah, the legs design is completely new and includes upgraded actuators with more power and more torque density. NASA will send the Da Vinci Plus mission to Venus in 2030. The Deep Atmosphere Venus Investigation of Noble Gases, Chemistry, and Imaging Plus mission will consist of a spacecraft and a probe. The spacecraft will track cloud movement and map surface composition by measuring thermal radiation from the surface of Venus, which escapes into space through the massive atmosphere. The probe will descend through the atmosphere, measuring its chemical composition as well as temperature, pressure, and wind. Skydio has officially launched its 3D scan software, turning the autonomous drone into a reality capture system. 3D Scan creates a model of the scene in real time, allowing the drone to automate the data collection processes needed to create 3D models with full coverage and ultra-high resolution. Space robotics is key technology for space exploration for scientific or commercial purposes. Interestingly enough, many space robots are tested on Earth underwater. For example, DFKI's Pulsar Test Basin hosted the first test of next-generation autonomous space telescope assembly technology in orbit. Chinese corporate giant Alibaba will develop unmanned trucks and robo-delivery vehicles with its subsidiary Cainiao, at least according to the Drone.com website. In doing so, Cainiao, a logistics company, plans to put out 1,000 man delivery robots on the road in China during 2022. Remember that in early 2021, Alibaba announced its computer simulator for testing drones. The system works autonomously and trains unmanned software 24 hours a day. And in Russia, the first unmanned logistics corridor will appear. It will be the M11 St. Petersburg-Moscow Highway, and unmanned vehicles from absolutely all countries of the world will be able to drive on it. The Neva Highway will start from transit corridor for unmanned freight traffic through Russia along the shortest route from Europe to Asia. Thanks for watching. Subscribe to the Pro Robot channel, like this video, and let us know down in the comments, what do you want to see more of from the world of high tech? And don't forget to turn on notifications and stay up to date on future tech developments.
this is the most expensive ITX case that I've ever reviewed at $500 US. Once you add in the few necessary options, that's what it comes out to. And surprisingly, it's one that you guys have been absolutely begging me to check out, and it's called the Winter One. And it promises both the best build quality and the best airflow that you can get from a space optimized ITX case. Essentially, if you're building a custom water-cooled PC, an RTX 90 and 2 radiators and sparing absolutely no expense along the way, this might be something that you're actually interested in. So let's get this thing built up and see if in any world there is a way to possibly justify that price. So unboxing the Winter One, this might surprise some of you, but you do actually have to assemble the case first, just like with the Form T1, for those of you who are familiar with that case. All of the parts do come flat packed and stored individually, but there are two main reasons for this. For one, it helps lower the price of the final product and the shipping cost, and also because building in the Winter One, you would need to disassemble most of the case first anyway. And just like the T1, assembling the case is super rewarding because the parts that you're working with here are unbelievably high quality. I mean, it truly is seriously insane for a PC case, and easily up there with the best. All of the panels are anodized and sandblasted aluminium, which leaves a super premium finish, kind of like an Apple MacBook, and the machining too here is absolutely flawless, at least on this review sample. Button here too is pretty cool and uses a KL box switch for some extra tactility. And so the build quality of this case is borderline obsessive, I'll say. It's really good, machine work is super solid, but the airflow design is what has me most interested because that as well has been kind of approached in the most optimal way. So we've seen with previous sandwich layout cases like this, where you have the line in the middle and you've got separate compartments, that negative pressure is what works the best. That means pulling air out of the case and then kind of air through panels to your components. So if you're using an air-cooled build, for example, that means you have the freshest air coming through the side panels and kind of leading to the best temperatures for your graphics card and CPU cooler. But also if you're using a liquid-cooled build, it's really important too, because that means that both radiators get the kind of cleanest, freshest air, and they're not passing hot air from the other. The cutouts in the panels as well for airflow are huge compared to your typical PC case, which you can see a lot of people not liking, but they do offer much less restriction. If you're not interested in these perforated side panels, you do have the option to go with solid ones instead, and there you do save a few bucks. But for a high performance system, I would recommend going for the fully perforated ones. They do look super interesting as well. I do like the look of them personally, but just be warned, they do reveal a lot of your interior components. In the end, we're left with a super high quality 15.5 litre case that's a bit bigger than the NCase M1 and a bit smaller than the NR200, but costs more than these two cases put together. At this size, it's pretty much perfect for a high-performance desktop ITX PC, but definitely not something that I recommend traveling around with. Now, building the case up, I did unfortunately find a couple of imperfections that are worth noting. Firstly, one of the side panels was actually somehow bent and didn't line up with the top panel at all, which really at any price point is something that's worth noting, but for a $500 case, it's just straight up offensive. I did manage to straighten it out with a bit of manual force, which no user should have to do, but it is what it is. And now with the panel straight, it is actually somehow a bit loose, which means that you do get this annoying rattle. Also, anodizing on panels is more matte compared to the rest of the case, which can be a bit jarring in certain lighting, and same with the rear bracket that secures the graphics card. Anodizing is always a really challenging thing for these cases, and it's really hard to get it consistent across all panels, but for a $500 case, I would expect this to be consistent. Alright, but enough talk about the shell of the case and the build quality, let's take a look at what you can actually fit inside here. And I think the most important thing to point out for the Winter One is that it's most optimized around a complete liquid cooling loop, that is a full custom water-cooled build. Sure, you can do an air-cooled build or an AIO build like this with an air-cooled graphics card, but at that point there is a bit of volume at the bottom of the case because you have a bottom radiator, and let's be real, the only way that you can really justify the price of this case is with a really high-end, fully water-cooled system. Now, for whatever reason, if you do want to stick an air-cooled graphics card in the Winter One, you can fit up to an RTX 3090 FE in here if you're just going with top-mounted fans and not a radiator, and CPU core height tops out at 70mm, allowing you to run at NHL 12S. yes. And then for AIOs and liquid cooling, 240 or 280 mil rads can be installed at the top and bottom with a total of 57 mils of clearance to play with. So your typical 30 mil thick radiator paired with your standard 25 mil thick fans do make for a really close fit. Just make sure that you also double check the width and length of the radiator depending on using it, because many will actually be too big. As for actually building in the Winter One, it's easy enough. Far cry from something like an N case or an NR200, where you basically just open up the side panel, drop in your hardware, and call it a day. To start with, the built-in I/O shield on my motherboard was somehow preventing the standoffs from lining up correctly, so I had to remove that before getting the board fully installed. Secondly, the power switch cables are way too short. Luckily, I didn't have a problem with them here, but plenty of other boards definitely will. Then, getting the GPU riser cable to properly clear the top-mounted fans on the AIO was a bit more challenging than I've seen in other cases, and graphics card mounting itself is just barely adequate. It has a lot more play than I'd like. The final fit and finish of the case as well is something that I'll just re-mention, with the front and rear panel not completely lining up with the top panel, which is a bit disappointing. And for those wondering, it was actually like this before installing any hardware. Now, although this is primarily custom loop, our test system looks like here against other ITX cases. Not surprisingly, the Winter One is towards the top of the stack with some performance. Under a 70-degree average here for our overclocked 10900K. It's only beaten by the subbed Mechwarrior when that case is running a positive pressure setup and intaking air from the front, but when it's also running a negative pressure setup better than the GPU like the Winter One, that's where the Winter One can beat it by a single degree. This makes it about 2 degrees cooler than the NR200 and about 8 cooler than M1. GPU thermals for the RTX 3080F especially for a 10-inch style case, tying the thermal noise performance you get from one of the highest airflow mid-towers that you can get on the market, the Fantex P5. It is beat by the NR by 1 degree, but considering the difference in noise level, I'd say the overall performance here is about equal. So overall thermals here are pretty most did that, but the true thermal capacity of this case isn't fully realized until you build it with 2 meters along with some serious hardware. At that point, you're almost certain you need what you need, N1 or a Mechwarrior or an NR200, but to the credit of those cases, they are significantly cheaper and in no way limited to thermal. Not to mention, they also aren't covered in massive holes from front to back to achieve that kind of thermal performance. This way they can disguise the interior of your system a little bit better. To be completely honest with you guys, I'm not sure I will actually get around to building a custom loop in this case because this AIO-based build was tedious enough, and I really don't know how many of you care about a custom loop in this case because it is really expensive. And that's the other thing, for that price, I was just left a little bit frustrated with certain aspects of it. At that price, it should definitely not have mismatched or misaligned panels, but here we have both. My top ITX case recommendations are still the NKSM1, the NR200, and the subbed Mechwarrior. Those cases are much easier to build in, less than half the price, and you won't need to wait around till the end of the year to actually get them. Technically, you can get the pricing of the Winter One down to $389 US with no options, but with just a 3.0 riser and solid panels, it's almost an even harder sell in my opinion. So to the small team behind the Winter One, what you have here is a really good starting point. The machining and the anodizing for 99% of the case is really good and some of the best that I've ever seen. But I can really tell that this is your first PC case. Some of the work here that just, like the GPU not fitting and the side panels not aligning properly, that stuff really needs to be perfect for an upwards of a $500 US PC case. And the pricing isn't even the biggest problem here, because I know plenty of people who are putting an RTX 3090 and a 5900X and liquid cooling it in a case like this, and they are more than fine to pay that kind of money for their high-end system. But again, for that price, the case really needs to be perfect. So I think that's where we'll personally leave the Winter One. For those interested, I will leave links down below, and I'd love to hear your thoughts down there as well. As always, a huge thanks for watching, and I will see you all in the next one. Alright, so some of you might have no idea what this is right here, but it's actually a PC case that I've been looking forward to for over 2 years now. It's called the DAN C4 SFX. Now, some of you might be familiar with the much smaller version, the A4 SFX. This is a fair bit bigger, but it can fit so much more hardware. Believe it or not, it's slightly smaller than the HSIANG-CHUN, but somehow more flexible, more build opportunities with larger radiator and fan support as well. So today we'll take a look at those different layouts, which ones are good, which ones should be avoided, and what kind of thermal performance you can expect, and ultimately just how this does compare to something like an HSIANG-1, which is a very similar size.
Just saying. Objective down.
So on the outside, the DAN C4 SFX looks like a pretty typical small form factor case manufactured by Lee & and the result is a 12-liter shell that looks like a hybrid between the HSIANG-M1 and the Ghost S1. This size is pretty much perfect for a minimal desktop ITX system in my opinion. Any smaller than this start compromising on thermal performance for high-end systems, and any larger really isn't necessary for most builds. Since it shares the same bloodline as the M1, everything from build quality and the look and finish of the side panels are pretty much identical. It's a very premium aluminium case that will last multiple years and many rebuilds. Just like the M1, this could very well be the last PC case that you ever buy, and another reason for that is just how much hardware you can fit inside it. The first layout here that we'll take a look at is the classic layout. It's a very intuitive, a very M1-like layout that's proven to be pretty much as space optimized as a 12-liter PC case can get. In this layout, you can do either air cooling or liquid cooling for the CPU. Up to a 240 or 280mm radiator can be mounted on the side bracket, and then for air cooling, you've got up to 130mm of clearance to play with. So your best option here for air cooling would be the Noctua U9S with a dual fan setup, but just like the M1, you can also fit the slightly better C14S by relocating the power supply to the front of the case. This brings me to another really cool feature about this case, and that's that it can be completely flipped and used upside down, and this is probably the best feature of the DAN C4 SFX and the main advantage over the HSIANG-1. Flipping the classic layout, for example, now means that the graphics card doesn't need to fight to pull fresh air from underneath the case, and instead now there is a ton of air up above to take advantage of. This does raise a concern though, and that's that you now need to consider more carefully where that hot air from the GPU ends up. For example, if you're running an AIO with fans as exhaust, a lot of that heat is just going to get sucked into the radiator and lead to much warmer CPU temps. Now the other layout of this case is the sandwich layout, allowing you to vertically mount your graphics card in front of the motherboard and then liquid cool the CPU with a 240mm AIO, but we'll come back to this one in just a minute because, long story short, it needs a lot of work. Now strangely, despite this having a slightly smaller frame than the HSIANG-1, it actually supports bigger radiators and fans. You can install two 140mm fans at the bottom directly underneath a 2-slot graphics card, and then on the side bracket you can install up to a 280mm radiator or two 140mm fans for air cooling. This also means potentially you could do a dual 280mm custom loop inside the C4 SFX, which is absolutely insane for a 12-liter case. Very important note though, if you are flipping the case, which actually ends up being the recommended way to go here, 140mm fans will no longer fit at the bottom, since you now need to make room for the top panel mounting clips. You can still mount a pair of 120mm fans here though, which will be powerful enough to feed air to your graphics card. And another really important note, one which I hopefully gets fixed, flipping the case means that there will be no panel at all on the bottom, so hopefully that gets sorted before launch because the cables kind of end up hanging out. Now as for building in the C4 SFX, it was super easy, almost identical to the HSIANG-1. Graphics card actually was a bit easier, in fact, since the locking bracket can be completely removed and the GPU can just be dropped straight in. 3-slot graphics cards up to 315mm in length and 130mm in height can be installed here, leaving you with plenty of options. So in the end, the C4 SFX in classic mode looks just like a slightly smaller, slightly smoother edged HSIANG-1. This test build uses an overclocked 10900K, a 280mm liquid cooler, and two 140mm fans at the bottom. All fans are positioned as intake, and the case is passively exhausting all of that hot air out the top. So how is the performance? Well, in terms of CPU thermals, our overclocked i9-10900K runs about 1 degree cooler than the HSIANG-1 at an almost identical noise level, seeing as we're able to accommodate a 280mm liquid cooler versus the 240 in the N case. When we flip the case though, CPU thermals increase by about 3 degrees, seeing as we now have less room to exhaust all of that hot air. Keep this in mind because it's a really important note. When we take a look at GPU thermals though, surprisingly they are measurably worse than the NCASE-M1 at 76 degrees C for our 2070 Super, until we flip the case, positioning the GPU now as top intake. GPU temps now improved by 4 degrees, giving us one of the best results in the stack, which is not bad at all. Now what happens when we throw in an RTX 3080 Founders Edition? This card runs at 320 watts and has a much more unique way of getting rid of all of that heat. As we've seen previously, this design works incredibly well in the NCASE-M1, but it's a bit more challenged here in the C4SFX. Here we actually have less of an air gap in the middle of the case, part of which is blocked by the tubing of the AIO, and this is really the only path for that second GPU fan to exhaust all of its heat. In the end, we run about 4 degrees warmer here than the NCASE-M1, since we're working with a tighter space. That does improve a little when we flip the case, but now we run into another problem. That hot air GPU is being straight into the radiator. Although this is for the GPU, that's a great way to run into CPU thermal problems, especially in combined CPU and GPU usage, like a very CPU intensive game, for example. Now I'm actually not going to spend too long talking about the sandwich layout of this case because, to be completely honest, it has one major downfall that needs a lot of work, and that's CPU cooling. Despite being able to accommodate up to a 240mm AIO here, it basically gets no airflow at all. In fact, under the same test conditions as other cases, even those with smaller coolers, the Dan C4SFX runs significantly hotter when used in this layout. So there are 3 main reasons why the cooling is so bad here. Firstly, when the case is flipped, air has to pass through 2 layers of ventilation, one for the top panel and then one for the frame. This means that the effective ventilation for those top fans isn't actually as much as you'd think. In fact, just by removing the top panel, I was able to drop CPU temp by over 5 degrees. Secondly, about half of the radiator is blocked by the riser cable, making it very difficult for air to pass through. And lastly, probably most importantly, the 240mm AI can only pull fresh air from one side of the case. So it's not like the Form T1 or Ghost S1 where a top-mounted radiator can pull air from both the GPU side and motherboard side. Here only one side gives access to airflow. So the sandwich layout in the Dan C4SFX needs to be reworked heavily in my opinion, because CPU cooling is just not viable with this setup. GPU cooling with this setup on the other hand is rock solid though, about 1 degree better than using the classic flipped layout with an AIO, so maybe there is something promising here. So at this point there was one more build / configuration in the Dan C4SFX which I think would be ideal for extracting the most GPU performance that you could out of this case, and one which could actually beat the NCASE-M1, and that's this build here. So we've got air cooling the CPU with the Noctua U9S, we've got a 140mm fan, and then a 2-slot GPU at the top, assisted by some fans pulling air through. So we've got intake here, intake for the CPU, and then all of that hot air that's building up inside the case is being exhausted by the 140mm fan. So with this setup, we get our lowest GPU thermals yet, especially when using the 3080 Founders Edition. Now we're actually able to properly exhaust all of that hot air building up inside the C4SFX, and I'd happily conclude that this is the optimal way to run this case for a gaming focused build. Most notably, you can achieve GPU thermals here that are slightly better than the NCASE-M1, and I think the difference here would be even greater if you were using a larger 2.5 slot or 3 slot graphics card without the additional fans helping it underneath. Flipping the C4SFX is so vital because then graphics cards don't need to fight to pull air from underneath the case, and that is more challenging for the stock slim fans that you'll find on those bigger graphics cards. The only downside of this layout is that CPU cooling will take a bit of a hit. Your best option here would be the Noctua U9S with 2 fans, and I'd say you're good for about 150 watts of CPU power there, being conservative. I'm actually running it with a single fan in this build, and that's almost enough to handle the overclocked 10900K that I've got in there, running at about 210 watts. So I guess the best way to sum up this case is that if you're not going to do this layout here, which is kind of the ideal layout for a gaming focused build since it runs the GPU the coolest and the quietest and has the most performance in that regard, then probably don't bother, because the sandwich layout just absolutely sucks when it comes to CPU cooling. And then if you're going to do this layout but then flipped, so kind of like like an NCase M1, you should probably just build in an NCase M1. That case does that layout a little bit better because it has a little bit more of an air gap in the middle of the case, and that does seem to benefit thermals and airflow. Then as for custom loops in the C4SFX, which is something that I'm really interested in trying because I think you might be able to even outperform the NCase M1, you can do a 240mm at the top in this flipped layout, and then either a 240 or 280mm at the side, and there you can pretty much run absolutely anything. Then as for pricing and availability, this case is set to launch towards the end of this year at 230 euros, which is definitely pricey, but nothing out of the ordinary for these premium small batch cases. But in closing, overall, for a gaming focused build in this layout here, the C4SFX is definitely up there as one of the best ITX cases. GPU thermals here are better than the Form T1, the NCase M1, and the SUPT Mechlicious, only to be beaten out by larger cases like the NR200. And I think just in general, with GPUs getting so much more power hungry and hotter and just demanding a lot more cooling, that makes a really strong case for the Dan C4SFX as your next ITX case. Really interested to hear what you guys have to say about this one. As always, a huge thanks for watching, and I will see you all in the next one.
Your visibility will be limited out there and have adverse effects on your sensors.
Today we have an exclusive look at an upcoming ITX case that's coming early in 2021. This is the Sunny Side Up Mechlicious, which quite honestly is a horrible name for a PC case. I'm not sure who decided that, but for the sake of this review, we'll just be calling it the SSU Mesh, and it is a seriously good ITX case. But that brand name, Sunny Side Up, or SUPT for short, it's the daughter company of Lee & Lee. This is their first case, and it's a collaboration between Lee & Lee and Ncase, so two very well-known case manufacturers at this point, and the result is an excellent ITX case. So this is a 14.6 liter vertical enclosure with full mesh side panels, which is simply awesome. It can support up to a 280mm AIO at the front, and massive graphics cards as well. But the best part is that this is aimed to be a mainstream case. It's going to be released on Amazon and Newegg towards the start of next year at a very acceptable price point of around 100 to 120 US dollars. So again, I think this is going to be the mainstream ITX case to beat next year. Let's take a look at what you need to know.
So we're going to be talking about these Circle CI convenience images that we have available on Docker Hub. We've built these so that it's easier for you to get started in testing and building with a lot of conveniences added right into these images. So let's start a 2.0 configuration file here. If you're on our 1.0 platform, I do suggest that you upgrade so that you can see all of this cool stuff and follow along. We have our version declaration at the top. We have our job section. We only have one job, which is to run a build, and then we need to select our executor for build, and this is going to be Docker. And then our first image that we choose in our Docker section here is going to be the primary container, and that's going to be where all of the execution occurs. And you'll see that we have multiple images selected here. So the second images will be added as services. And so we have this concept of language images and service images. You're going to want to use language images as the primary container. It's going to have a lot of the additional tools that help you get things done. So for instance, in this Python image here, we also have browsers installed as well on this image to help you get started with browser testing faster. So always use a language image as your primary container, and then you can add these additional service containers which give you access to things like database. So we're defining an environment variable in our first image here, which is where everything is going to execute, and we're giving it a URL, which is going to be a database URL. We're telling it that it's a Postgres database, so it'll know to default to the Postgres default port. We include a database and a user already in this Postgres image, which the username is root and the database is Circle Test. So you can begin that username and that database without having to set up and create it yourself. This Postgres image that we have here is slightly modified. You'll notice that it says -ramp at the end. It runs in memory, and that way you're not hitting the disk, and this is going to significantly improve the testing performance on this Postgres database here. So now we're going down to the steps and we're running the usual checkout, which you would do. We don't have any code, so it doesn't matter. Here we are installing the Postgres client tools. We don't include any client-specific database adapters, so you're going to need to install those yourselves. For instance, since we have a Python image here, maybe we want to install Cyclopedia 2 so we can interface with the Postgres database. In this case, I'm going to be installing Postgres client tools, and that's going to give me access to PSQL. You'll also notice that we're running sudo here. The images do not run under the root account like most containers do by default. We have a Circle CI account that runs by default. And so if you want to have any administrative privileges or root privileges, you're going to have to put sudo in front of your commands. Then we have 3 commands here, which is just showing us interacting with the database service that we have created. So it's a PSQL command where we are creating a table called test. We are inserting into that table, and then we are selecting from that table. And if everything goes well, our build should come out green on the Circle CI website. So after committing those changes and pushing them up to my GitHub repository, we automatically trigger the build on Circle CI, and we can see that we have spun up our primary container here, which is the main environment that we're operating under. You can see it all happening here. You'll also notice that we inject a bunch of convenience environment variables into the primary container that you could use potentially in addition throughout the of your build. So we have the node index, we have the node total, so that's helpful to use and know when you're running parallel builds. You also have a bunch of project information, so it might be useful to check that out. So here we have our database service spinning, and that we are automatically creating our database Circle CI test, and we're also creating that root role that you can use to log in and start running your test. Once again, just to show we are not running as root, you can see that we are running as a Circle CI account, and then over here we have our database where we are creating a table, and then we are inserting a value into the table, and when we run a select on that table, that the comes out as well. If you like this video, you'll encourage us by hitting the like button and subscribing. All relevant links will be in the description, so if you want to check that out, you can see the link to our 2.0 project tutorial, which has a lot more information on getting you up and started with the 2.0 platform. If you like having a chat, you can head on over to our Discuss forum where we talk about this video and anything else related to Circle CI. Thanks for watching.
是爸爸妈妈给的，是爷爷奶奶给的，也可能是你和我给的。血缘不是孩子拥有家的唯一方式，和法门和机构带你收出养，从爱出发，为孩子找一个幸福的家。给孩子最好的，孩子最好的。儿少收出养制度，让爱圆满。以上广告由卫生福利部社会及家庭署提供。
So first off, let's get a size comparison out of the way to see how big this thing really is. The SUT is slightly larger in volume than the NCase M1 and NZXT H1, but it's significantly smaller than the Vertex Shift 2. And despite being larger than the NCase, the footprint is actually quite a bit smaller, so that's one of the best things when it comes to using this as a desktop gaming system. The exterior is super clean. I mean, no visible branding or logos here except for a small little stamp on the rear, and overall this can make for an incredible looking minimal system for your setup. The configuration uses highly breathable mesh panels on both sides, the front and the top, and these feel quite premium. All of the panels are very satisfyingly snapped on and off with push pins, and you will have for tempered glass as well. Not really sure of the premium that's going to be added there, but I'd only really recommend tempered glass if you're also cooling your GPU and don't need to rely so much on side panel ventilation. Then for front I/O, super clean again, just located at the top of the case. 2 USB ports here, one being one Type B, although I haven't confirmed which speeds these are running at. So with vertical PC cases, you've got a decision to make when it comes to your rear I/O. You either have it at the bottom, like the NTX-TH1, or you can have the rear I/O located at the top of the case, like the Pentax Evolve Shift 2. Neither option is better than the other one in my opinion, because both result in the case being overall a little bit larger. You either have the case a little bit taller off the floor, as in the H1, or have a bit of extra space at the top, like the Evolve Shift 2. I will say though that both of those approaches they're a bit of a compromise to user experience, right? Because you need to plug in a monitor to your GPU, or maybe use a USB-C port on the back of the motherboard. You have to kind of flip the case around or route it through the back panel or something like that. But this case does things quite a bit differently, because the rear I/O for the motherboard is located directly at the back. So the way that the SSU mesh gets around this is by cleverly folding the GPU riser cable at a 45-degree angle, allowing the motherboard rear I/O to be still directly pointed out the back of the case and for the GPU to be mounted vertically. In my opinion, this is the best layout of a vertically oriented small form factor case. Rear I/O is so much easier to access, and you still benefit from that nice compact footprint. However, we still run into the issue of the graphics card I/O being pointed directly downwards, and here it's actually pretty bad because a regular DisplayPort or HDMI cable is just impossible to insert. So the solution to this is to use a cable with a 90-degree port. They do include a 90-degree HDMI cable in the box, but seeing as a lot of gaming monitors these days require DisplayPort 1.4 to get the full refresh rate out of, I'd also recommend grabbing a 90-degree DisplayPort adapter. Connecting the cable is still relatively easy though, thanks to the cutouts in the bottom, and in my opinion this is a sensible compromise to the unique layout. But now let's make our way to the interior of the case, which is surprisingly really simple and straightforward. In fact, it reminds me a lot of the Chimera Mac 1 prototype, which we had a look at over 2.5 years ago, which unfortunately never saw production. So it's your typical sandwich layout with your motherboard and power supply on one side and your graphics card on the other, and then we can mount up to a 240 or 280mm radiator at the front. So from memory, this makes the SSU mesh the that I've reviewed that can support up to a 280mm radiator, and not only that, but we have up to 65mm of clearance between the front panel and the spine of the case. So 280mm AIOs will fit just fine here, leaving you 10 to 12mm of extra clearance. I'd recommend installing an AIO like I've done here, running the tubes from the bottom supply to the pump block. It is possible to route the tubes from the top and then around the cutout in the motherboard tray, but I think you'll just end up with some really awkward tube routing. Having the tubes at the bottom makes for a much simpler layout. Of course, you could go with air cooling if liquid cooling is not your thing, and being a full mesh enclosure, I think the results would be pretty good. However, you only have up to 72mm of clearance, which is kind of one of the compromises of a sandwich layout case versus something like an NR200 or an Ncase M1. So 72mm of clearance, that kind of leaves you with a Noctua NHL12S as one of the most recommended options. ATX power supplies are also supported here, but I'd highly recommend avoiding them in this case. You'll just end up with way too much cable slack, and there's also no room left to mount an AIO at the front. SFX and SFXL are the way to go in my opinion. There's plenty of high power options out there on the market. This way you also have a bit of extra room left between the power supply and the graphics card for cable management. I'll also note that facing the power supply fan outwards was the only way that I was able to install this specific unit, which is the SF600 Platinum from Corsair. Otherwise, the included 24-pin cable is just not long enough. 315mm long 3-slot graphics cards can be installed here as well, with a height of up to around 140mm, although that is including the power connectors, which are around 10mm on their own. So for cards that have recessed power connectors, a height of 140mm will be fine, but for cards with standard power connectors, they will need to be under 130mm. One card which did not fit in this case was the Gaming X Trio from MSI. This is the RTX 3080, but for the purpose of dimensions, I believe the 3060 Ti all the way up to their 3090 uses the same cooler design. The length of this card pokes out here at around 325mm, so I couldn't actually get this installed in this case. The card that's in there at the moment is the ROG Strix RX 5700, and that comes in at 305mm in length, and that was no issues getting it in there. So I don't have an official spec of what is technically supported just yet, but it seems to be around 315mm. And I'll also mention that being a sandwich layout case, as we've seen in previous testing flow-through cooler designs like this one where you have the fan on the backplate or where the backplate would be are not expected to work well with this case. So I haven't tested this just yet, but you can only expect that having the fan directly against where the motherboard is, that's just not going to make sense thermally. Now in terms of storage, despite most ITX builds these days just using a couple of onboard M.2 NVMe drives, you can install up to 3 2.5-inch drives in here as well, 2 on the floor of the case and then 1 towards the bottom of the spine behind the power supply. If that's not enough and you are trying to build a system that's mostly based around a lot of storage, you can use a shorter graphics card mounted horizontally using the expansion slots towards the top of the case, and that way you free up space to mount an additional 2 3.5-inch or 4 2.5-inch drives using the included bracket. Keep in mind though that your graphics card will need to be less than 215mm in length if you are using a pair of 25mm thick fans at the front, or less than 180mm when using a standard front mounted AIO. I'll also note that the spine of the case can be shifted to allow a 4-slot graphics card clearance if that's something that you're interested in running. I don't think 4-slot cards actually exist, but this might be applicable for someone running a 3-slot card who wants a bit of extra clearance. Just keep in mind that your CPU cooler height and pump block height will be limited to just 52mm. Also, if you are interested in building a custom loop in this case, there isn't much room at the bottom for a pump or a reservoir, but with a clearance of 72mm you will be able to use the Barrow CPU pump block and reservoir that we took a look at recently. That, along with a set of low profile fittings, would be an excellent way to get a custom loop up and running in this case. Now the airflow setup in this case, you can either go with a positive pressure setup, which is going to be a little bit better for CPU thermals, or a negative pressure setup, which is going to be a little bit better for GPU thermals. So with positive pressure, that's kind of how I think most people would intuitively build in this case. That's going to be pulling air from the front and then pushing it through the side panels. Negative pressure is going to be the reverse of that, of course, encouraging air through the side panels and pushing air onto the radiator this way. Typically, negative pressure is what is recommended for sandwich layout cases like this, or the Form T1 or the Ghost S1. That way you really are benefiting from all of that kind of air that's coming through the side panels and assisting the small fans on your graphics card. So starting off with CPU thermals, here we have a new best result, and by quite a big margin. Versus the Cooler Master NR200, the SSU mesh runs 7 degrees cooler for our test system here, which uses a 10900K overclocked to 5 GHz at 1.27 volts. Granted, we are using an updated 280mm cooler, but the thermal difference here between the Z63 and X62 in my testing showed less than 1 degree. So the best CPU thermals in this case are achieved with a positive pressure setup, bringing fresh air in through the front panel. Thermals are around 7 degrees better there compared to a negative pressure setup. But the reverse is true for GPU thermals as we expected. There, negative pressure actually works better since we're encouraging fresh air through the side panels and assisting the graphics card fans. Our results there land us right around the N-Case M1. There's no reason you couldn't run some of the beefiest, most power-hungry GPUs on the market in this case. There is plenty of ventilation to support that, but there's just not enough active cooling in the way of extra fans to push it to the top of the stack to beat something like an NR200. Then for VRM thermals, despite not much active cooling getting across the motherboard, you'll still have nothing to worry about here. It ties the top results, which would be the NR200, and that's partly due to the superb CPU thermals. So for mainstream builds, high-end systems, custom loops, and everything in between, this is looking like an excellent option. Dare I say, it's going to be the mainstream ITX case to beat starting in 2021. As a vertical case at least, I much prefer this over the NZXT H1 and the Evolve Shift 2. I'm personally trying to find something, critical or negative to say about the case just to kind of balance this review a bit, but there's really nothing that I can say about this that I don't like about it. The layout is simple, it's really easy to build in, and I really do love the vertical form factor with that really small footprint. I also think that the direction that hardware is going in with bigger graphics cards and higher TDPs when you're looking at liquid cooling, I think this approach to prioritizing thermal performance is a really important one, and again, I think this is the case to beat in 2021. So really excited to see this one reach market in February, and I will be doing a few more content pieces on this one as we approach that release date. I'd love to know your thoughts and comments down below as well, so feel free to leave a comment. As always, a huge thanks for watching, and I will see you all in the next one.
It's all about finding balance in life, right? So somewhere in between me trying to speed build a computer in 17 minutes and it taking me 5 attempts to get my time down to that point and me being like sweating at the end of it and not having any time to give you guys any instructions or insight about what I'm doing, and taking 6 hours to swap out a motherboard in my personal rig, there's gotta be a happy medium. And that is exactly what today's build is all about. This, my friends, is the happy medium machine. Now, our goal was to build a respectable gaming rig for the modest price of $500 US, not including peripherals and monitor and all that kind of stuff. Now, admittedly, we did go a little bit over our budget. We ended up closer to the $580 range, but there are definitely some places where you could, trim a little bit of fat in order to hit that price point and then easily upgrade later. Like, for example, we did include a hard drive so that we can actually install a decent library of games on it, assuming we're playing modern AAA titles, some of which are 100+ gigs per game. But you could scrap that. You could install and remove your games as you play them, and then just kind of wait to build up some budget to upgrade your storage down the line. So we're still calling it a $500 gaming rig, and we are gonna get started building it right now at a happy medium pace. So we're not gonna speed build, but I'm also not gonna take like an hour to build this computer. And it's brought to you by Ridge Wallet wants to redefine the wallet with its compact frame and RFID blocking plates. Check out how they can help keep your wallet bulge down and use our offer code LINUS to save 10% and get free worldwide shipping. And we're back. Yes, that's the way that we do that. All right, so the first thing we need to decide is whether we're gonna go with the windowed or non-windowed version of the MG120G from Cougar. Rawr. Which one's the windowed one? The G? All right, we're gonna go with the non-windowed one because this build is all about modesty and doing things that actually make sense. If you are spending $500 on a gaming rig, you should be saving the $5 or $10 delta between the windowed version of the case and the non-windowed version of the case, and you should be spending that on a graphics upgrade or a CPU upgrade, something that you're kind of stuck with for an extended period of time versus something that can be easily upgraded down the line, like for example storage or system memory. Now, I took a lot of flack when we did a budget build recently, configuring it with a single stick of memory with the intention, of course, of upgrading to dual channel later. People said, hey, the performance sucks. But I'm of the mind that any performance that I give up today, like let's say I save 5% of my budget by going with a single stick of memory, but I lose 5% of my performance. That's a trade-off that doesn't cost me anything in the long term. It's just sort of like deferring that performance and cost to a later time. I fully understood that that was not the ideal configuration and that dual channel makes a big difference to system performance these days. It's just a matter of whether that's a system performance compromise that I'm making that is going to cost me more down the line, or whether it's one that I'm making that I can just say, hey, you know what? My performance isn't enough today. I'm gonna go to the computer store and buy another stick of memory and put it in my system because I've saved up my lunch money. My parents gave me lunch money and I decided not to buy lunch and I just stashed it so I could buy cool stuff that I want. Not that I'm speaking from experience. Let's go ahead and install a CPU. So for our motherboard, we went with the ASRock B450M Pro. This is just such a great balance between performance and cost. It's MATX, so you don't get some of the expansion that you might expect from a full-size board. You've only got 3 PCI Express slots. But let's face it, when you're using a B450 board, you don't have the same degree of chipset features anyway, and an MATX board is a really good compromise there. So we've got our socket AM4, we've still got 4 memory slots, so we can load this puppy up. We've got 2 M.2s, and then of course the PCI Express slots, and actually a pretty reasonable mix of I/O with 6 USB 3+ ports. only gigabit Ethernet. It's not until you step up to B550 that you're going to start to see things like 2.5 gig Ethernet on these more value-oriented boards. Let's go ahead and switch to our top down here. For our CPU, we've gone with a Ryzen 3 3100. This thing is just an outstanding balance of price to performance. And I know that we've said some things about it in the past, like that we don't think it makes necessarily the... oh wait, no, sorry, I'm actually thinking of when we got slammed for a completely different video. Yeah, Ryzen 3100 we actually gave it an extremely positive review. The one thing that we did get criticized for recently about it is, yes, I know that you can step up. Okay, so you can step up to a 3300 and that does make a big difference to performance, but I still maintain that even if you're going to end up with a little bit of latency due to the 2CCX design of this one, it's at a certain price point, not the kind of thing that you're going to notice when you're pairing it with a 1650 Super. That's something to bear in mind about the way that you typically benchmark hardware versus the way that people actually deploy it in the real world. If you want to pop in here, go ahead and install my CPU. Just lining up my diamond with the, see that little arrow on the edge of the board right there? Got the arrow? Nice, thank you, David. Now I've already got flow plane chat being like, why not 3300X? Okay, alright. I just talked through this. Not 3300X, because I think that when you're trying to hit a price point, there are cases where, look, comparing it with the 1650 Super, realistically, 3100 ain't gonna be the bottleneck in that system anyway. From a gaming standpoint, this is a gaming-focused system. I think it's fine. Speaking of things that are just fine, for cooling, we're going to stop cooling. In fairness, like, AMD's stock coolers these days are actually pretty legit. Like, they are literally double the mass of Intel's. I still remember when Intel did away with the copper plug down the middle of this style of heatsink that they've also used for many, many years. And if I recall, we might have actually we either did a video benchmarking the difference between the new and not improved, the new and not improved all aluminum version and the version that had the copper slug down the middle. In fact, you used to be able to see it through the fins back in the LGA 775 days. Like, it kind of had like it was like a copper tube, and then the aluminum fins were all attached to it around the outside. We either did a video about it or did some testing, and I just don't get it. Like, the amount of savings that Intel must have there, I don't see how it's worth it. AMD clearly doesn't see the point, so they still include decent coolers with their CPUs, and I commend them for it. Oh, I am gonna need to take the brackets off. All right, I'm gonna not put my thermal compound on, and I'm gonna go ahead and just use this screwdriver that I want you all to not worry about. Just don't worry about this screwdriver. You should have no worries in your mind about this screwdriver. Why are you guys being so worried about it? I just don't really get it. Everyone's stressing out, you know? I actually have been tempted to pick myself up a nice little utility belt or tool belt. Ever since I was doing a bunch of like network cabling, running in my attic and installing security cameras in my house, I've actually been doing a bunch of home upgrades. And I found myself needing to carry, here, let's get correct thermal paste application up in here. I'm just gonna do kind of a fat boy grain of rice here. I found myself needing to carry, like, you know, hammer, drill, crimp tool, side cutters, some RJ45 ends. Like, it's gotten to the point where even my stretchy Costco jeans just can't contain it all. Like, look, I can store an AMD stock cooler in my front pocket, but it's just, you know, it's not quite enough at a certain point. All right, let's go ahead and install this puppy. You're good, David. I love, this is another thing that AMD/AMD's partners don't cheap out on compared to Intel boards. I love that AMD, even on their consumer platform, still has a backplate. There have been boards that I've seen that have just these plastic, like these little plastic bracket things, and then they just use push pins to go through the board. But unless you're buying like some super random board on AliExpress or something, the vast majority of them have a backplate. And I just love coolers that mount with a proper metal backplate compared to ones that use plastic push pins. I've just seen such terrible things happen in shipping. I mean, recently we had the PewDiePie Creeper PC get destroyed in shipping, even though everything was mounted with metal. Like, that should give you some idea. I have seen systems come back after being shipped across the continent with a pushpin style cooler. And it wasn't really stock coolers back in the day, because this was when I was at NCIX. We didn't ship a lot of like custom systems with stock coolers. So it was, there was a particular Arctic cooling one. I want to say like Freezer 7 or something like that. This is like way back in the day. Anyway, it used push pins. And people kept configuring their systems with these things. And NCIX's philosophy was kind of like the Burger King of custom computers, right? Like, you have it your way, we'll build whatever you configure. So that thing was a great value because it was like 20 bucks. And it was like a tower cooler at a time when those were usually quite a bit more expensive than that. So people kept configuring their systems with these bloody things, and we'd configure them, and I'd see these systems come back that looked like they had been kind of like picked up and drop kicked repeatedly down the length of a football field, with this cooler having popped off and banging around inside the system. We're talking graphics cards that were like ripped out of the slot, but still screwed in back here. So the slot is just like gaping open, none of the pins are making contact. We're talking hard drives getting knocked out and like putting, like, not dents. I'm not talking dents. I'm talking like you can see through the PCB holes in the motherboard. I've just seen such, and you know, as someone who, especially at that time, you know, really had basically no money, right? Like, I'm working as a sales rep at a computer store 2 days a week. I'm going to school at the same time. I pretty much had no money. I like loved hardware. Like, it was all that I lived and breathed. And just like seeing those things, actually traumatic. Like looking at, you know, a $3,000 gaming rig that's just, you know, SLI, and this cooler came off and just like knocked both of the video cards out, and they were banging around inside the case, and like the power supply survived, it's still screwed in, but like the back of the case is now bent from the weight and it's scratched all over. Like, just had to steady myself, you know. Sorry, I said this stream wouldn't go on for too long, so let's go ahead and plug in our CPU fan here. So it's pretty typical these days, and man, ASRock has done such a great job with their budget boards. Come on in here, David. It's pretty typical these days on what used to be high-end boards having a feature where you have two CPU headers. One for the CPU fan if you've got a conventional setup like this, and a second for if you've got an AIO and you've got sort of one connector for your fan or fans and then a second connector for your pump. So you just want to watch out, just watch the labeling, because you'll usually have CPU fan 1, CPU fan 2, or CPU fan and CPU fan opt. Yeah, so this one is labeled CPU fan 2/water pump. Unfortunately, ASRock in their infinite wisdom put the silkscreen under this heatsink for the VRM, so you actually, you actually can't read it, but it's probably in the manual as well. So that's it. Our CPU cooler is install-emulated. King in the North, I've only been live for about 20 minutes or something like that. Half an hour? Half an hour? Wait, what? I've been live for half an hour? We gotta build a computer here, ladies and gentlemen. All right, we're not installing an M.2 SSD today. We're gonna be going SATA. So we're pretty much done with the motherboard now that we've got, oh yeah, no, we can go ahead and install our RAM. I love that in the time since AMD Ryzen launched, we've gone from DDR4 like 2400, 2666 being affordable to you can actually put DDR4 3200 RAM for not much more money in even like a $500 to $600 class gaming rig. It's great because even though the performance delta might not be huge in some applications, going from 2666 to 3200, some things it will be big. And I, for one, love getting the most for my money. That's what it's all about, is not leaving performance on the table unless you absolutely have to. And it wasn't that long ago that in order to hit this kind of price point, we would often tell people, hey, yeah, you're probably better off just getting a single stick of RAM today to give yourself more room to upgrade in the future, because that way, if you have enough money for, let's say, 8 gigs of RAM, instead of buying 2 4-gig sticks, which is about the same price typically, and then limiting yourself to 16 gigs of total upgradability, you can buy a single 8 gig, then a single 8 gig, you get your extra performance, and that gives you up to 32 gigs before you have to start, throwing things away or flipping them on Craigslist in order to get back some of your budget. All right, let's go ahead and open up our case. I'm just gonna open up the super chats here.
So you will have to search the area.
I'm glad you guys like the live streams, because honestly, it's a lot of fun for me too. I actually kind of enjoy just building computers. I find it relaxing. But I'm at the point now where I don't need any more computers. It's like, what a struggle, It's a bummer. I just want to build computers. I mean, that's ultimately why I got the job at the computer store. I wanted to be a tech, but I understand now why they didn't allow it. I simply didn't have the relevant experience at all. Yeah, I get it. So they put me in sales, but I would still hang out in the tech room whenever it was slow in the store. And sometimes Andrew, I don't know if you're out there, Andrew, you're a good dude though. Sometimes Andrew would let me work on some of the systems. He was willing if I made a mistake, which I don't think I ever did, but he was also a super nice guy, and he might just not have told me if I made a mistake and he had to cover for me. But he'd help me out if I made a mistake. I ended up being really good at sales though. Go figure. Yeah. So I ended up spending most of my time doing that, even if I did want to work as a tech. It's probably just as well, because the transition from sales to the business side of things was a lot easier than I think the transition from technician to the business side of things. And that ended up being a really good career move for me. All right, so pretty simple case here. MATX, really compact. Single included fan, that should be enough cooling for our configuration. This is just a Ryzen 3100 and a 1650 Super. It's amazing to me though how far budget cases have come. On the one hand, I lament sometimes the loss of the cases of old. I mean, we're talking cases that weighed like 20 pounds on their own. They've got cross braces everywhere. Like, you grab onto these things and you're like, wow, there is no flex in this whatsoever. Whereas I've seen modern cases that you basically have to screw the motherboard in order to give the case structural rigidity. You know what I mean? So I lament that sometimes, but the number of features that you can get in a budget case these days. Where's my, do I have a price, like a price list for this thing? On the Trello card. All right, there we go. Like, how much did we pay for this puppy? $50. Love it. And even the non-tempered glass version does have just at least, like a see-through front panel. It looks kind of gamery. I'm not a huge fan of restricting airflow in the front of a case like this, but again, for this kind of build, it's not a major concern to me, because you've got this, again, magnetically filtered. Absolutely love it. You've got this magnetically filtered top that is going to end up being used as an intake, even if that wasn't the original intent, because we're going to end up with probably negative airflow or negative pressure inside this case. If I was building this for myself, what I would probably actually do, as crazy as it might sound, is, you know what, let's just do it. I'm gonna go out on a limb and I'm gonna say, this is what I would do. So remember, I'm someone who's trying to hit a price point here. I don't have a bunch of money to spend on extra fans. It's shocking how expensive the fans are when they're not included with your case or with your AIO liquid cooler if you want anything that's decent quality, right? So I would probably pull this out, and I would throw it in the top of the case where I have a nice filtered intake, and I'm gonna put it towards the front so it's blowing air right down where the graphics card is going to be. So yeah, I'm gonna go ahead, I'm gonna put it right here, just reconfigure my included fan. Like, there's no real reason that it has to be in the back like that, other than that's the Intel ATX specification. Ooh, fun fact. I was reading an article on Anantech the other day about a new power supply standard that apparently, I think it's Intel championing it, where basically we're gonna do away with the 24 pin, and we're gonna do away with 3.3 volt and 5 volt all together coming out of the power supply. So the computer power supply is just going to handle AC, so that's your 120 volt to 240 volt AC to 12 volt DC, and then splitting out 12 volt into 3.3 and 5 volt is going to be done on the motherboard level. I'm really interested to get my hands on it, and I just got a shipping link. So I actually am going to have both a motherboard and power supply for this new standard coming fairly soon. Really excited to check it out. The main play here is just simplifying the power supply and improving efficiency, because DC to DC conversion is more efficient than AC to DC conversion. Now, a lot of modern power supplies actually do that internally anyway. So they'll just do DC to DC conversion from 12 volt to 3.5 and 5 volt anyhow. But presumably there's some kind of benefit to moving that onto the motherboard, and I look forward to talking to some of the engineers who are working on it to find out exactly what those reasons are and bringing that knowledge to y'all. Okay, so that's where I want to put my fan. This is powered by either 3-pin or 4-pin Molex. So I'm just going to rip this Molex connector off because Molex connectors suck. What year is it? And we're going to plug the 3-pin into the motherboard when we get a chance. Let's go ahead and install our I/O shield. Uh-oh. Where's my I/O shield? Oh, there it is. And I never miss these when I get to work with motherboards that have them included. But it's also a small price to pay for, you know, spending oftentimes, you know, $20, $30, $40, $50 less on your motherboard. I've been for a long time an advocate of getting the motherboard that has the features you need, as opposed to worrying about, you know, every theoretical, you know, mad gain you're going to get from some kind of more robust VRM solution. It's like, yes, if you're a professional overclocker, you're going, you know, dry ice, liquid nitrogen, or whatever the case may be, there's absolutely a benefit to your, you know, $400 motherboard or whatever. But if you're someone that's just going to basically say, okay, I'm going to enable multi-core enhancement, I'm going to put some decent cooling on this thing, make sure I've got good airflow over it, I'm just not convinced that it's worth the money, and B, the extra time. We've actually got a really fun video coming soon where Anthony and I went head-to-head in what we're calling the Tech Triathlon. You were there. What do you think? Fun competition?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so David helped us film that one. And what it is building a gaming PC, overclocking